Hello, my name's Tom Butero. I'm a clinical social worker. I've been in the field for over 50 years now. And during those 50 years, much of my effort has been devoted to the study, practice, and research of suicide assessment and suicide prevention. The result of that is that I've written a book. Here it is. It's called I Don't Want to Die, a new look at suicide assessment, intervention, and prevention. The book is available online through Amazon, Barnes and Noble, an interesting online bookstore called bookshop.org, and several other sites as well. So I just want to mention that. And I want to talk about a specific issue today. And this is kind of the beginnings of suicide assessment in terms of where you would start with your clients or anyone else that you might have concerns about. Um, Let me start by talking about the myth. The myth in this case is that if someone is not having any thoughts of suicide, if it's never occurred to them that that might be an issue for them, and you ask them if they've ever thought about suicide, the myth is that you've then planted the idea and then they're going to go ahead and take that idea and go ahead and make a suicide attempt as a result of that. That's just absolutely not true. The fact is, by asking the question, you're showing that you care. You're showing that you want to learn more about what's going on with that person and how they're feeling and what they're thinking. Um, and you want them to know that you genuinely are concerned about their welfare. Uh, the issue here is how you approach it. The issue is how you ask the question, what you say, and how you present it. And let me tell you a quick story. When I was doing my first year graduate internship, I was placed at a mental health clinic in a suburb just outside Chicago. And I had a client, a young man, probably in his mid 20s, who came to me reporting that he was having issues with depression and anxiety. And I started to do my regular assessment with him. And it got to the point where I needed to approach this issue with him. And I looked at him and I said, "Have you been thinking about doing something?" He looked at me very puzzled and he had really no idea what I was talking about at that point. So I tried again. I said, "Have you had thoughts about doing something to yourself?" And again, he still looked very puzzled. It was like he had no idea what I was talking about. Finally, I said, "Have you been thinking about suicide?" It was like the clouds had opened and I could visibly see him just kind of that kind of response. And it was like, okay, now we can talk about this. Now we can go ahead and we can address the issue. The point is, if you're going to ask the question, and you need to, if you're going to do an assessment of suicide risk, you have to start with the question. The point is, though, you have to ask the question directly. You have to use the words. And there's different ways of expressing that, of course. You can say, like I did, "Have you been having thoughts of suicide? Have you been thinking about killing yourself? Are you having any suicidal ideation?" Any one of those approaches is fine. The point is, you've got to be very direct and you've got to be very specific about what it is that you're asking. Otherwise, the client's going to sit there like my guy did, and he's going to have no idea what you mean. So it's important to ask the question. So, what happens when you do? Generally, a couple of things will occur. And I find that when I've met with clients and when I've asked that question, I find most of them are actually pretty honest about their response to me. Someone who is feeling suicidal, someone who is having suicidal ideation, um, may answer that question very simply and say, "Yes, I have. I've been thinking about hurting myself." If that's the response you get, there's a whole series of other things that you need to explore with that person. And I don't want to get into too much detail now. We'll talk more about that in subsequent videos. But basically, there's some things you want to know in terms of their suicidal ideation, and there's a level of risk that you want to determine based on those factors. Some of them are demographic, simply in terms of race, ethnicity, age, um, all sorts of different demographic characteristics that point to certain levels of risk. The other thing is any family history of depression and or suicidal behavior, um, the level of depression that they're experiencing, and a whole number of other things that you want to explore with the person. But the important thing is, again, to ask the question, and if you get a positive response, then you need to take the next step in terms of your risk assessment. The other side of the coin is someone who says, no, no, I'm not having any suicidal thoughts at all. Um, what you don't want to do is go like this and go, great, thanks. Now we can move on to something else. No, I never take no at face value. I never look at the person who says, no, I'm not having any suicidal ideation and think that, okay, that's great. Now we can move on. I need to do a little more exploring for a couple of different reasons. One, oftentimes when you're doing a suicide assessment, you're doing it during the first session. The person has met you for the first time. They don't know anything about you. There is not yet a level of trust that you've established with that person. And sometimes it's an issue of why should I tell you anything about myself, and especially in terms of my own suicidal ideation? Why would I share that with you? I don't know who you are. I don't trust you. I don't know what you're going to do with that information. So it's important not to take no at just face value. It's important to do a little more exploration and asking questions like, have you ever felt suicidal? Has there ever been a time when you've entertained thoughts of suicide? Is there anyone in your family that's had an issue with this as well? Um, has your depression gotten to the point where maybe those thoughts might enter into the realm of possibility? All of those things are worth exploring with the person. You can also do a little bit of, I don't want to say prediction, but kind of looking at what circumstances might occur in the future. In other words, is there a point at which you think that might become an issue for you? Is there something that might be going on later on that you think might contribute to any suicidal feelings that you might have? Um, Again, it's hard to determine the future. It's hard to predict, but those are kind of things you want to explore and try to get as specific as you can, because going forward, if you continue working with this person, um, those are some of your red flags that you want to watch out for. In other words, does the depression become worse? Are circumstances entering into the situation that might exacerbate the depression and get to the point where the person might then actually entertain thoughts of suicide? So you want to do a little bit of exploration around those kinds of things. Um, the bottom line is it's important to ask the question. Whether you're meeting with that person alone, and maybe they've never shared that information with anyone and they're about to share it with you, or maybe you're meeting with that person, be it an adult, adolescent, whatever, with someone else there in the room with you. It could be a family member, a spouse or partner, parent, sibling, whatever. Um, when that happens, when you've got someone else in the room, I can't tell you how many times I've been in that situation, and a lot, particularly with adolescents. Adolescence was another specialty of mine. I just simply enjoyed working with them. Um, but I can't tell you how many times I have been in my office with the young person and their parents. And when I get to the point in my assessment where I ask that young person about suicide, so many times I've heard either, yes, I've thought about it, or even going beyond that, I've had many, many adolescents tell me that they've actually entertained making an attempt. I've had others who have actually said that they've made an attempt. The interesting thing about that is so many times the parents have no idea what's been going on. I remember one case in particular, I had a young man, 15, 16-year-old, and when I asked him the question, he said, yeah, he had taken a length of rope and he was seriously considering going into the attic of his house, tying the rope around the rafters and hanging himself. The parents were like, what? Yeah, they had no idea that this was going on. And that says a lot about what the communication was like in the home. That says a lot about the relationships between this young person and his parents. And those are certainly things that needed to be addressed. But my point is, if I had not asked the question, none of this information would ever have been made available to me and to the parents. Um, and we worked out some things to work on as far as addressing the issue, addressing the situation, so that the young person felt a little less like hurting themselves. So, but my point is, again, and I can't emphasize this enough, you have to ask the question. It opens so many doors. It opens so many avenues for you to explore with your clients or with a friend or a family member or whatever the situation may be, where you can help that person work through what are oftentimes some very scary feelings. And actually, I find sometimes when I ask the question, um, particularly people who deny any suicidal ideation, they become almost indignant about it. And it's like, how could you even think that of me? How could you ever even think that I would entertain those kinds of thoughts? My approach to that is, this is just a regular part of my assessment. This is just a regular part of what I do. I ask this of everyone. Um, if you're a little bit offended by it, I apologize, but it's something that I feel like is an important part of what I do. Um, Most people, though, as I said before, they're going to be honest with you, and actually, in a lot of cases, going to be relieved that you're willing to ask that question and you're willing to explore that with them. So don't hesitate to do it. Asking the question opens all those other doors, and then you can begin to move forward. So I hope this little bit of information is helpful, and thank you very much for watching and listening.